I'm Jan Visser, and I'm meeting here in Austin with Mike Spector. Mike wrote a chapter with the keywords inquiry, reasoning, and critical thinking. Thinking and writing about such issues emerges somewhere in a person's life, and it evolves over the lifetime. How come that this is a key concern for you at this time in your life? Where did it start in early childhood, during your formal education? Perhaps you could sketch that trajectory of development in your life that relates to what we're talking about.
Okay, maybe I'll work a little bit backwards, because I did my PhD in philosophy here in Austin at the University of Texas. And so, and the way I paid my way through graduate school was none of the philosophy professors wanted to teach logic, which was taught by the philosophy department. And I said, I can do that. I had been trained by IBM as a programmer before coming here. So to me, it was just a different formalism. It was the same structure. So I taught logic, and I was convinced logical reasoning was important, and it is in philosophy, so it's valued very highly. So I had that for my graduate experience. In early childhood, I probably had some influence from my father, who was a rabbi, and that was my early destination, because there's a long tradition in my family of rabbis, and I was the one that broke that tradition. I had a scholarship to go to a rabbinical high school and then to a yeshiva, and I turned it down, and my father never held that against me, or never even strongly persuaded me that I shouldn't do it. He said you should follow what you're interested in, which turned out to be philosophy. But early on, what he modeled for me was the value of questioning. And so he would ask us questions and encourage us to ask him questions. And when we did ask a question, he didn't give a simple answer typically. He would give multiple answers and leave it to us to figure out which one of these made sense. And that's partly a tradition of commentaries on the Jewish law. But anyway, so I guess that's a short version of how I got here. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think you're in your chapter you also refer that this is particularly important in our time. Could you elaborate? Right,
yeah. So I was ready to retire recently, and but then I was convinced that, well, my work's not done, because my students are not very good at critical thinking. To write a dissertation, you have to have a really good argument that flows coherently through that dissertation. And that's what all of my students were struggling with. And so, and then with the political situation in various places around the world, there's all these controversies, and people are not thinking critically about these. And then people become polarized, family disputes develop, that they just hate anybody that doesn't share their view, and this didn't seem right to me. So I thought, well, what's gone wrong and where can it be fixed? And my thinking came around to the notion that it goes wrong in early childhood education. And so I looked at what was happening with math education, and I saw typically things went wrong at the middle school level when the movement was made to algebra. On a small example, people in the US are trained to think of the equal sign as an assignment operator rather than a balancing operator. But that's not true in other countries. And then it also has to do with, that's where symbolic thinking and reasoning is introduced, and also a proof. And the notion of a proof, well, usually it was introduced in a geometry course. Well, we no longer require geometry in high school. So people grow up and get to college without knowing or understanding what a proof is.
It sounds like quite unique in the world that geometry would be...
It's an option. Now, when I grew up, it was required. And I liked it because it was fun to prove things. And they're powerful geometry tools.
I even got sort of pre-geometry in kindergarten, playing with shapes and...
Exactly. Well, I think that still happens, but the notion of a proof procedure, where you have axioms, and then you go from knowns to knowns, and then and you have to defend every step. And it's the defending every step, applying a theorem and applying it correctly, and knowing or showing how it's correct. That notion is lost. We have a lost generation. This was required when I went to school, and when I went to school, a logic course was required at the college level.
Mm-hmm.
That's no longer the case either. So no longer is, and that's where proofs would come in, and the notion of having a coherent argument or a well-reasoned argument in defense of something. So we're not teaching this in a disciplined manner. I remember when I was in graduate school, I came across a book written by Matthew Lipman. He was a philosopher in Pennsylvania, and he argued that you should be teaching logic to third graders. And so he wrote a book called Harry Stottlemyre, which is a play on the name Aristotle. And so it's a wonderful little book, and I thought, what a great idea. And I have a copy of it at home. He did another one for ethics, and he said, same argument. The ethical reasoning needs to start early, called Lisa, and was the name of that book. And it never scaled up, no large-scale impact from these little books. But I thought, he was right. And so I picked up on that when I was in graduate school, those two little books. And those ideas stuck with me.
Yeah.
Ironically, the only other person I've met when I mention these books that even knows who Matthew Lipman is or knows about the book Harry Stottlemyre was a Malaysian educator. Just I happened to mention it at the University of Malaya at a meeting one time. And he came up with the name Matthew Lipman. I was talking about the book, Harry Stottlemyre. He says, I know Matthew Lipman's work. So I was shocked somebody else knows about this. But in the U.S., it has not caught on at all. So I'm reverted back to that training also, that there's a place for this. Now we can do better than what he did. He was basing it on Aristotle's syllogisms, but logical argumentation can go well beyond that and should.
Mm-hmm.
And it needs to start early. And what he showed was that, well, it can start in the third grade if you want to. Yeah.
Interesting that you mention ethics and because when we over those years that we've been working on the idea of building the scientific mind,
Right.
the description of what is involved in it evolved also over time. It started with a simple concern that people should learn to think like scientists do in a context in which science normally operates. But then we discovered it's much more involved, and we ended up with that definition that I have here. And I think there's quite a few things in there that connect with
Oh yeah, this
what
is good.
we're talking about.
No, this is spot on. This definitely connects really well.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things that comprises habits of thinking, values, and a complex array of skills and capabilities. Yeah, so this fits in line really with what I'm most interested in now is developing in young children these habits of mind, inquiry and critical thinking skills. And I think of it as a developmental approach.
And that is one of the three bullets in the definition, of course, because there's the layer above that. Let's say that why do you do that? What values drive your existence and your way of being in the world, and so they're ethical and aesthetical conditions that I can't say determine your behavior, but that are providing the backbone for who you are and how you behave. And in that context, you require those skills, and in your context of interest.
Yeah, no, this is exactly right. This is what really 21st century skills should be about. Mm-hmm. And it's consistent, but we don't see this being emphasized in schools or with kids. So I've been experimenting with this approach for introducing these skills with young kids with my 7-year-old grandson. So one of the things I do is I will tell him things that I know are not true, that are outrageous, trying to get him to question me and say, is that really true? Yeah. So and eventually he's catching on that he's willing to do that. So he's willing to question an authority, which I think is one of these little mini skills. So one of the things I did a long time ago with when we put the master's program online at Syracuse University, what I noticed was in the discussion forum, there was some one-way discussion back and forth between a student and me, but there was very little crosstalk. And so I thought, what's wrong? This is not right. This is not what would happen in a face-to-face setting. So I added a student to the class, which I called Alcibiades, from one of Plato's dialogues. And so I told the class, we have a new student, his name is Alcibiades. And then Al, who was me, starts to question me about all kinds of stuff. And suddenly this crosstalk starts to take place among the other students in the classroom. Mm-hmm. So I did that for a couple of years, but then the word got around that, Alcibiades is really Mike, so don't, just ignore him. So I had to quit doing that. But but so getting them to question things and to question authority is one thing. It's okay to question authority. It's okay to think of differently than your parents or differently than the teacher. And the teacher needs to encourage that, but that's not what teachers do. What we teach people to do, what we teach kids to do, is to have right answers. We don't teach them to look for evidence or to ask why is that right or what's another possible explanation, those kinds of things. So this, I've been working with a Chinese company. I'll go off on another tangent here if that's okay. NetDragon, and they're one of the world's largest makers of games, game-based applications for mobile devices. But their CEO is serious about education. So, and they have funded a college in the Fuzhou province, and also in Fuzhou, and in the Smart Learning Institute at Beijing Normal University. And now they have a Center for Innovative Technology at my university, in my department. And I was pitching a project to the CEO about critical thinking skills. And so he's interested in this, and it's going to be the first project I think they fund at my university. And the idea is, and I was pitching this, well, we need to start early in middle school level. So I was arguing that for him. And his response was even earlier. And then the idea was that I said, well, we don't do this with one game. This is not a one-off kind of thing. This is a developmental process. And because we need to develop these habits to get kids not only to ask questions, but to be occupied with having a question, but then to go from having a question to presenting them with a puzzling situation where they have to find an explanation and then think of alternative explanations and figuring out which is the most likely one. Mm-hmm. So there's a progression that takes place over years.
And children often have questions of themselves to start with. And so it's important also that the teachers be able to recognize and encourage actually those questions that the students have to come forward and to make them the starting point for working.
Right, so this can come from the kids, and it requires a lot of changes in everything, at home and in schools, in the education system. And but that's why I haven't retired, because now I have this new project. So.
It will mean that you can never retire.
Yeah.
What you're trying to achieve requires of teachers to develop totally different behaviors. What do you particularly expect that they should? How they should perform in their classrooms, how their school environment should be organized, restructured, perhaps not structured at all.
I've made the mistake of thinking this was an easy problem, and if I just go to the teacher with what I thought was a great new technology, long time ago, Logo was an example, and I went to teachers, and they had gotten a new Apple IIe lab at this elementary school near my university in Alabama, and I said, I'll go over and teach them how to use Logo on these Apple IIe computers, and that just totally failed. And it was because I was treating the teachers like they were computer science students. And so there was a lot of frustration the first year. The teachers didn't vocalize it, but I sensed it, and I was frustrated enough, so the next year I said, I'll just work with the kids. So I had third grade kids volunteer after school and taught them about Logo. And it was a completely different experience. So the one kid won the state contest. He created a Logo simulation of a tornado. And it was amazing. His father was a weatherman, so he was interested in tornadoes because of his father. But he created it himself in this after school project. So we can make changes. But then I left. and then so nothing was sustained, and the teachers didn't change their behavior. So I made the mistake early on of thinking, well, if you just have a cool technology or something you think is effective, it'll change and teachers will change, and it's not that simple.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was thinking, well, we need to change teacher preparation programs, but then they're very reluctant to change. So I've tried this a number of places where they don't want to listen to anybody outside the College of Education, and specifically the teacher preparation program in that college. So I remember one meeting I had when I was at the University of Georgia with all of the department chairs and the dean, and at the time I was the director of program evaluation, among other responsibilities. So I was in the meeting, and he was pitching the idea of iPads, using iPads in the teacher preparation program. And with one exception, every chair that was there said they're just toys. The only chair that was an exception was the math science chair, because there were a lot of educational apps that she actually knew about on tablet devices. So after the meeting, the dean came to me and asked, what can we do to change their perception? Because he was already convinced that this was a powerful tool. So I didn't take up the argument with him. I said, if you really want to change their perception, give every one of them a tablet computer, which he did. So the next year, they started integrating tablet computing into the teacher preparation program, because that's what kids have they have in schools. Mm-hmm. And so the teachers were going into an environment that they were not prepared for, because they didn't have any exposure to tablet computers. So every teacher in the College of Education now gets a tablet computer.
Yeah, but there are lots of stories also on trying to introduce technology by just providing the equipment, and it ending up on the shelves.
No, that's true.
So how, in that case, how did they manage to not just to get it in the hands of those people, but
the difference. I know. You're right. Absolutely right. In schools, that's failed. I went into several schools where they said they had computers, and they were still in boxes. They weren't even unpacked yet. Mm-hmm. But these were chairs of departments. So I figured, okay, they have it. They'll carry it around. So I had some confidence. I knew who they were. They'll start using it, and they'll find stuff, and they did. Mm-hmm. So that group it worked with, but that strategy does not generalize to teachers at schools. No, so then, that's a big failure of it, and teacher preparation, professional development, ongoing support. They're never well prepared to use the technologies when they're introduced, and sometimes they don't even unpack the technologies when they're introduced. So. Yeah. Now,
if we look around the globe, there are, of course, countries like this one where it is absolutely affordable that people make use of technology and have abundant technological tools available. But there are places where they're not. To what extent, actually, is what you want to achieve dependent on technology, and what are the particular advantages of including technology in the package that you need to offer?
Well, I know in some places that mobile devices have much larger penetration than tablet computers or notebooks or desktop computers. So, and then the notion is, well, kids play games on these things. Mm-hmm. So games, especially for young kids, can be designed to have learning outcomes. Yep. So I think that's a possibility. So I have colleagues that have been specializing in that area. But I don't use my own mobile phone that way, but I know a lot of kids do. And then they also use it to talk to each other and to communicate. So when you get stuck on an idea, asking someone else is a good thing sometimes. But then there's some downsides to all of the social networking, which we've seen recently too.
Yeah, there are quite some stories coming out actually that are quite negative about what happens via the social media, and potentially it should be a great tool, of course, for people to question each other, but then this questioning dialogue that should develop I rarely see it actually
No.
when I explore Facebook.
Yeah.
And,
No, absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So I have a Facebook, I have a Twitter account. I just basically don't use them because I don't value what's there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then in China, it's WeChat, and I belong to a bunch of WeChat groups. They actually, at the university level, use those for learning purposes. But but I'm not participating just out of a choice. Too much to deal with already. But again, I think it has to do with habits and early training of kids to value that there are other ways to think about things. So this change has to start early with kids. And if you want it to really be effective and scale up, then you have to train teachers differently. So the training teachers differently part is, I don't think I can, that's too difficult for me, but maybe I can contribute something to the early childhood, developing habits and values and attitudes and ways of thinking about problems where they really dig into alternative solutions and different ways to think about it.
Tell me a bit about your international experience. You have traveled quite a bit, visited different countries. How are they different in terms of what you want to achieve?
Yeah, I'm thinking of this differently now than when we talked earlier, because I'm thinking back when I was at one point in my career, I was a senior scientist for instructional systems research at the Armstrong Laboratory in San Antonio, and I was working on a project providing automated support for the design of instruction. And I had heard about people, and I got invited to a NATO Advanced Study Institute in Canada. And I met a bunch of European researchers in this same area, and I became aware of a bias that I had that I didn't know that I had. And I had assumed all along that Americans were the only ones doing interesting research in this area. And then I met all these Europeans that were doing interesting research. And so the thought was, well, now how can I, thinking selfishly, benefit from their research? So it turned out the Air Force had a program, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, AFOSR, that would sponsor international visitors to a U.S. installation. And so I started inviting these people, and over a 2-year period, I invited 28 international visitors to my lab to talk about things related to instructional design research and automated support for instructional design. So I got networked into a lot of people outside the U.S., and I became aware there was a lot more going on elsewhere than I had previously been aware of. And eventually I went to Norway as a result of that and got hired by the University of Bergen. When I was in Norway, I was visited by the person managing that office for the Air Force who was stationed in London, and he came to me and asked me how I managed to get so many people to come. And I said, I just asked. And you always funded it, so nobody ever said no, so I kept doing it. And he said I had used the program more than everybody else combined in that 2-year period. So he was wondering how, and I said, just get people to ask, because people will want to share what they've learned. I've been shifting my interest to Asia, and partly I had a program that went on in Indonesia for 5 years called Distributed Basic Education, and I was working with the Open University of Indonesia, Universitas Terbuka, on developing their capacity when they had online instruction. How would they be able to carry it out? And we had a number of interesting projects there. In that 5-year period, the capacity never developed, so they didn't get implemented. So that was a disappointment to me. So I never got to see the fruits of all that work, although they were definitely serious about doing it. But they couldn't penetrate into rural areas, and the people managing the cost of the internet access were commercial companies, and they didn't place high value on educational access. So it was really too expensive for most schools and universities outside of the major cities to use. And then somehow I got involved with other places in Asia, the University of Hong Kong and University of Malaya, and now in China, also in Taiwan, at East China Normal University in Shanghai. I'm a visiting professor there now. And Beijing Normal University, they have a Smart Learning Institute. I'm also a visiting professor there. And I'll be visiting both of those places next month. So So and it's interesting to see what other people do and how it's different, and how some of the same problems exist. The teacher preparation stuff in China, they have the same problems we have. Teachers are trained to do things one way. China's very advanced with new technologies, but they're not penetrating into schools, with one major exception. In Beijing, there's a place called the Beijing National Day School, which has 5,000 residential students. It's a junior high, high school, middle school, high school combination. The middle school, they have to accept anybody that applies from that part of Beijing. The high school is competitive. To get in, you have to score well on the test. And that Beijing National Day School embraces what we think of as the maker movement in a large, systematic way. So, and almost all, they don't have classrooms, they have laboratories where kids design things, make things, market things, and the proceeds come back to the school. And this school was started in 1952. It's one of the few things that Mao didn't destroy. Somehow he saw there was a value in this school. And it's lasted to this day, and they're very innovative, but I've never seen any other place anywhere that matches that school in terms of their innovative approach to not just technology, but pedagogy in general. So they really, experiential learning is promoted all the way through. And the kids do well on their standardized tests. In China, how well you do on the high school, at the end of high school exam, depends on the quality of the university that you can enter, and then people want to go to the best universities, and those students score just as well or better than other students do. So on standardized tests, even though they have a radically different approach to learning.
You make the argument in your chapter that we should not see higher education as the principal province in which these developments happen. It should go down to secondary, primary education. You're mentioning early childhood education. Normally when people talk about early childhood, it's actually before the school age.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts about how early one should start?
Yeah, I don't know. That's definitely outside my area of expertise. But when I was a parent, I mean, I had 5 of my own kids, but we always thought music would have some effect. And so listening to music, then there were debates about what kind of music should it be. Should it be classical music or jazz or what I liked, was rock and roll. But in
terms of critical thinking,
but I think talking to kids. I mean, before they go to school, they learn to talk. I mean, when they're 2, they're talking. I mean, in complete sentences, and probably they're having complete thoughts.
And they are
much earlier than that.
They are exploring. They are asking questions and asking questions themselves.
So I mean, finding parents to support that. What I noticed, we seem obsessed with discipline in this country, especially in public settings. So if you go into a grocery store or a mall and a kid is acting out or running around, the parent is going to rein the kid in and restrain the kid. But I've in China, the few times I've been in a mall or a grocery store, kids are just as wild. Same thing in Norway. They're just as wild as they are here, but the parents are not obsessed with disciplining the kid or reining them in. And the kids don't seem to do as much damage. But so there's a different attitude about that. The emphasis is not on discipline so much. I've asked some Chinese parents about that, and they say, well, it's the same. It's really, they have the same discipline problems we do. I don't know. I haven't observed enough to know if that's true or not true. In Norway, I noticed when you go into a public building in Norway, typically there's a place for kids to play that's set aside. I mean, you go into a bank, and there's a little corner of the bank where kids can go sit and play while the parent does their banking business. And that's very rare here.
It depends a lot also on the extent to which children are able to behave when not disciplined. And if it all depends on discipline, yes, you need to be there as someone who disciplines them, but that's a matter of how you make them grow up and the kind of conditions that you create in the family environment.
The critical thinking skills definitely can start early, and then can start in a conversational manner. I don't know if you remember the program ELIZA That was it was a psychological. It was designed to pass the Turing test, so you couldn't tell if it was a real counselor or if it was a computer. And it was a simple program, and it would basically just ask the person talking to Eliza behind a screen or behind a wall would say something, and Eliza would pick up a key word. If a person mentioned his mother, Eliza would say, "Well, tell me more about your mother." So it was a conversational interface a long time ago, and in a lot of cases, in some cases, it passed the Turing test. So you couldn't tell if it was a computer or a psychologist. So my notion is conversational interfaces are going to have an impact, and that's what we need to have for these kids. It's like a companion that they can talk to, but the companion is going to basically be encouraging them to have questions, first to ask questions, and then to give them situations that they need to explain, and then to find evidence to explain the situation, and then be developing information about the child so they know what the kid's interests are and also what their weaknesses are, and then the system can tailor things appropriately to that individual child. So I think that's all within the realm of possibility.
And the first companions in a child's life are, of course, the parents. Normally.
Right, normally. And kids that don't do well typically have a lot of bad parenting going on early on in their life. Yeah, so we can't do much about that. I don't know how to change that.
Now that you have written the chapter, how do you want your readers to approach that chapter?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess when I was writing it, I was thinking more about the value of logic and emphasizing logical reasoning, because that was a lot of my recent training.
I remember that was your first draft.
Oh yeah. But I'm thinking now that it's just the value of thinking critically and what I've recently called having questions. So to have a question means, first of all, you admit you don't know the answer. So just admitting you don't know, that's something a lot of Americans anyway are not able to do with regard to something obviously complex, politically or religiously or ethically or otherwise. Well, I really don't know. Well, then once you admit you don't know, the next step is to say, well, I want to know. I'm willing to devote time and effort to try and find an explanation to this something that I don't understand. So those are the things I think that need to be emphasized early on. But then you can't get people to devote time and effort to something they're not interested in. So that's why the parent or the teacher or the system needs to understand what this kid is interested in. Yeah.
And the children need to have conditions that allow them to express their interest.
Exactly, to support the kids in exploration,
Yeah, I think one more question regarding the definition of the scientific mind that we developed. There's if we see it as very much a multi-dimensional concept. There's so many different things involved.
Right.
This is by far complete, but it highlights a number of elements that came up in discussions that we had over the years in different places of the world. Yeah, we put that into the...
I know, you can edit it in later.
Footage. But looking at them, are there particular things that sort of stand out for you that you think are important in the development of a scientific mind?
Yeah, so I'm looking at some of the things that are called 21st century skills now, and I see critical disposition, and probably there's other ones that show up like that. Creativity, collaboration, all show up as 21st century skills. But then this inquisitiveness off to the side. So one of the issues with this is it's better than a Wordle anyway, than just having single words, because it has phrases. So I like that better. But so there's no centrality to this, and so having some connections. So inquisitiveness and exploration are connected. And then evidence-based reasoning, that's really where I was, I guess, in my early. That's the argumentation stuff that I was especially interested in earlier on. But I think these other things are important too. And then these, what we can think of as mindsets or habits of thinking. Dispositions are part of that. And So there's some things
Yeah,
that are related.
there are relationships among them.
among these things.
But they're not, it's...
This one here, the awareness and critical appreciation of your prior assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
In what I call this 9-phase model of critical thinking, that one shows up as sort of a later phase to appreciate what you were assuming that you weren't initially aware that you were assuming. Like I mentioned when I went to Canada, that NATO Advanced Study Institute, I just had this unstated assumption the best things are happening in America. That's why I got invited, and it turns out I'm a minor player in this field compared to these other people who are here. So, and I didn't even know I had that assumption until I went and saw. Yeah. So skepsis here is, that's my dissertation was on skeptical reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
And so the notion of
It's a very interesting
skepticism.
concept, right?
What's that?
It's a very interesting concept.
Well, it
skepticism.
is, because when you look at this in the
It's often
ancient Greeks,
misinterpreted.
it basically, to be a skeptic is to be an inquirer.
Yeah.
It relates to the word for inquiry, searching for an answer. So a skeptic is someone looking for an answer, and that's really why I came up with my having, a question. It means you're willing to look for an answer, not that you're giving an answer, but you're looking for something.
Yeah.
So yeah. So,
Well, that's why we changed the title of the book. Initially, we had it simply building the scientific mind, but then I think this new idea of seeking understanding is actually key to what is at stake.
No, it is. It's very much in line. I took philosophy of science courses when I was at UT Austin, and it totally is in line with what I learned there. But in America, if you say someone is skeptical, they automatically interpret it differently than you or I would.
Yeah.
They think you're doubting it. You think it's not true. But that's not the skeptical position. No. The skeptic's position is, I want to understand, I want to know, I want to find evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're querying things. And,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No.
Well.
Yeah, no, this is an interesting framework. So attacking little bits and pieces, but doing it on a large scale over years and with kids, I think is where I hope I can make a little bit of a positive contribution.
Yeah, we live in a complex world, of course, and this is, I think, another reason why this is so important. The kind of questions that one has to have nowadays, they're no longer of a kind that they assume a linear relationship between cause and effect. It's in fact a bit like this picture. It's chaotic, it's half chaotic, but there's also structure in it when you start looking for it. And that's typically the case of the world. And the kind of problems that humanity has created around the globe, they're astronomical. The notion of the Anthropocene, the climate change, the destruction of the microbiotic environment, and it's very complex indeed. So it requires citizens that are able to think in a more sane way, I would say.
Yeah, what occurred to me is, a lot of these ideas are totally in line with how I've been thinking. So I like this a lot. So you got to share that with me at some point, so I can share it with other people. Yeah. But what I was thinking parallel to that would be, where does it go wrong? So what things inhibit these things happening? And so what comes to my mind are a couple things. So greed, so a company wants to make a lot of money and they don't care what they have to do to make the money. So they're going to violate a lot of those principles that might be associated with those things just to make money. Or arrogance, believing that I have this idea so it must be right. Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that get in the way. And then I think just bad habits. They've just developed a habit of doing things one way. We've always done it this way, that's got to be okay. It was good enough for me, it's got to be good enough for everybody else. Yeah,
you mentioned in your chapter somewhere the world of selves and selfishness, I think. And in contrast to the world of families and communities.
Oh yeah, was that me? Did I believe that?
Yeah,
but
you
you remember
said
what I
that.
write better than I do. Yeah, yeah.
No, I actually highlighted that.
Oh,
I found it
okay.
very interesting.
That probably came out of my experience in Indonesia because I learned a lot there. Their value system is so much different than ours in a very positive way.
Yeah, I can't agree more.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, thank you
thanks.
very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
It's
Thanks
great
for the
talking to you.
opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah.